wanted to introduce myself and to welcome you to our presentation this morning. My name is Jonathan Ward, and I have the great fortune of being the co-author of a book that's coming out about the recovery and reconstruction of the Space Shuttle Columbia after the accident in 2003. I'm very happy to have with me today Jerry Ross, seven-time astronaut, who was deeply involved in the recovery of Columbia, and he's going to be here to share his experience with that part of the operation. And I think you'd be really fascinated to hear about his firsthand involvement in bringing Columbia back home again. This project started off as a result of a completely chance kind of thing that happened 2 years ago. I was at the funeral of a friend of mine who I'd met in doing my Apollo books, Norm Carlson, who was the launch director during the Apollo years. And he always told me that the best hire he ever made was a fellow named Mike Leinbach, who became the launch director for the last third of the shuttle program. Mike and I met at Norm's funeral, and we said, hey, let's get together and talk and just get to meet each other. It's a strange thing that I can say that I actually can tell you exactly when this book idea was born, and this was on April 9th, 2015 at 12:42 p.m. We were having lunch at Cracker Jack's in Titusville, and Mike said, I always started to write a book about Columbia, and I said, let's talk about that. And Sue Roy was there and snapped this picture of the two of us together, and that's actually when the book idea started off. Mike was the launch director for Columbia. He was also in charge of the rapid response team from Kennedy Space Center that went out to recover the debris from Columbia, and he ultimately became in charge of the reconstruction effort of Columbia. And this book originally started off as his idea of telling his story about his involvement in his Kennedy Space Center team. And in talking to people that he introduced me to, one of whom was Jerry, Jerry said, you can't tell this story without talking about the people in East Texas. It's really their story. It's not just about the people from NASA that did this. It's a much larger story. And in the process of doing more interviews and things, we ultimately ended up expanding the scope of this book to beyond the several hundred people from Kennedy that did this to 25,000 heroes who took part in bringing Columbia back home again. These are 25,000 people who had no involvement with the space program whatsoever, but who sacrificed their time, and in some cases, two people sacrificing their lives to help NASA get the Space Shuttle program back on track again. So it turned out to be a really remarkable story, and we're really excited to be able to bring this to the public. Very briefly, I'm not going to talk too much about the mission itself or the precursors to that. These are Columbia's crewmen. Commander Rick Husband is reclining here. We've got mission specialist Mike Anderson, pilot Willie McCool, Dave Brown, Ilan Ramon, who was Israel's first astronaut, Laurel Clark, and Casey Chavla, who was an Indian-born American citizen. They flew a 16-day Space Hab double module in orbit with Columbia. Everything appeared to be just fine during the launch when we watched it from the ground, but to the shock of people analyzing the video afterwards, about 82 seconds into flight, we saw this chunk of foam about the size of a briefcase fall off the external tank and appear to impact the wing of Columbia somewhere. One of the cameras that had the best view was out of focus and was not able to see what it was. You can see from this video here, it looks like this piece of foam comes off and hits somewhere on the wing, but they're not able to tell exactly where it was. Did it hit the leading edge? Did it hit the underside of the wing? Nobody could really tell what was going on. There was a lot of debate in Houston about what to do about this. One of the problems was that Columbia didn't have a remote manipulator system arm installed for that mission, so there was no camera that they could move around to see the wing or the underside of it. This was the view from the back of the crew compartment looking back, and the area that would have been damaged is somewhere back in here, and it's hidden from view by the cargo bay doors. So there was no way to visually inspect the orbiter while it was up there and to determine what the damage was. And the best minds in NASA through a failure of imagination, as Andy Chaikin was talking about yesterday, were really not able to figure out how badly the orbiter was damaged. But space shuttles had endured bad damage before and had made it back home. Jerry was on the most heavily damaged vehicle that ever returned safely from orbit. Atlantis and STS-27 had over 700 tiles damaged as a result of some ablative material coming off one of the SRBs. So NASA felt this was probably a glancing blow. It was just a 1.5 pound piece of foam after all. If it hit the tile, it was probably just some surface damage. If it hit the leading edge of the wing, well, the leading edge of the wing is made out of RCC, reinforced carbon-carbon, which is very strong, unlikely to be damaged. So the preparations were made for Columbia to come back home. Its reentry burn happened normally over the Indian Ocean on the morning of February 1st, 2003. Its track took it across the southern United States, and as it was passing south of Dallas to be preparing to skirt around the Gulf Coast and come to Kennedy, they lost communication with Columbia. Sometimes there are communications blackouts that happen as a result of plasma around the vehicle, and so that was not considered to be too unusual, except that communication blackout began to last longer and longer. This happened right about 9 o'clock Eastern Time with an expected landing of 9:16. And when the ground tracking radar at Kennedy was not able to pick up Columbia, they knew something had happened. This was a strange occurrence. It was one of those things that NASA had never envisioned. Mike was telling me that with the recovery teams, they always anticipated that an accident was going to happen within sight of the launch pad or within sight of the landing strip. There was no thought that there could be an accident that would happen this far away from home. So as a result, NASA didn't even see this. Nobody from NASA saw this. This was what was happening as Columbia passed south of Dallas until after the accident, well after the accident had happened, and then this news got relayed to the folks in Mission Control. The people who were waiting at Kennedy only heard silence. Jerry was one of the ones out there at the runway. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, what that was like for you.
After my flying career was over at NASA, I took a management position which entailed me being at the Kennedy Space Center for every launch and every landing, and I was down there waiting at the end of the runway for them to come home. And when we started to find out that they had lost communication with the vehicle and then lost tracking with it, I got out of the vehicle that the landing team was in and called the astronauts that were escorting the crew's families and told them that we had lost the crew and please get the crew's families back to the quarantine facilities at the Kennedy Space Center. And that started a very long and nightmarish day for me.
Jerry was one of the last people to see the crew before they left, and he was going to be among the first to see them when they came back home again. And I can't imagine what that was like for Jerry to go through that.
In addition to that, I had two of the members, Mike Anderson and Dave Brown, who had worked for me at the Kennedy Space Center doing different types of support activities, and I had helped in getting them assigned to that mission. And I'd flown with the entire crew down to the Cape before the launch.
So there was silence in Houston. There was silence at the runway at Kennedy. What was not silent was for the people who lived along a track between Dallas and the Louisiana border. They heard over the course of about 2 or 3 minutes, and some of them said it sounded like it lasted for 10 or 15 minutes. They heard a constant, loud, rumbling, banging series of explosions, uninterrupted series of explosions that lasted for 2 or 3 minutes as they had no idea what was going on. Most of the people there didn't even realize the space shuttle was re-entering overhead. What was happening there was tens of thousands of pieces of Columbia, all of them breaking the sound barrier. And so they heard just a continuous set of explosions. It was knocking things off of shelves. One of the law enforcement people I talked to said, "I went to the door of my house prepared to meet Jesus. I was sure it was Judgment Day." Another person said, and he was perfectly serious, another person said he thought New Orleans had been destroyed in a nuclear blast. People thought that pipelines were exploding, that planes had collided. They were hearing things whizzing through the air. They saw smoke trails going overhead. People really didn't know what was going on. And it turned out to be a course of about 250-mile long track between Dallas and Fort Polk, Louisiana, where things started literally falling out of the sky for 45 minutes. Bits and pieces of the shuttle were showing up in people's yards. anything from a few scraps of tile to large pieces like this part of the tunnel here. The immediate response from law enforcement was to try to post people at each of these sites, and quickly they ran out of people to be able to guard all of this debris that was coming down around the ground. We even had large tanks from propellant tanks from Columbia that were coming down, mostly intact. Some of them still carrying hydrazine or nitrogen tetroxide, or also carrying liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen from the fuel cells. So there were dozens of these tanks that were coming down, mostly intact, floated to Earth. NASA's immediate concern became public safety. How do we keep people from being hurt by the dangerous materials that might be on board here, as well as all these unexploded pyros that could have come down? And so going after the debris and protecting the public was the number one thing. That was actually the first thing that Sean O'Keefe said at Kennedy Space Center when he saw the film of the Columbia breaking up. His first thing was, I wonder how many people on the ground we just hurt. And miraculously, nobody on the ground was hurt. There was actually remarkably little property damage, considering more than 80,000 pieces of the shuttle came down. And people started finding things that were more gruesome as well, that really kind of began to bring home to them that this was not just an airplane that had broken up. With a piece of a helmet was found within an hour or so after the accident. Here's part of the sole of a boot from, again, people suddenly realized there was a very human aspect to this tragedy. The local people really immediately mobilized, and this is one of the things that I had not appreciated, was that even the smallest counties, and we're talking about a very sparsely populated area of East Texas, it's mostly piney woods area, the area of Sabine County, which is right on the Louisiana border, only has a population of about 10,000 people in the whole county. 2/3 of the county is forest, national forest. The biggest town in the county is only 1,100 people. But they had people who had been trained in an incident management system, an incident command system, to be able to immediately start trying to put their hands around what was going on here. How do we get all of the appropriate assets within the county organized to make sure that we're protecting the public safety? And it's a discipline that I did not realize that even the smallest police departments are trained in. And I think it's one of the things that made me want to really kind of share this story, is how prepared our local police departments really are to help us through this kind of incident. So these guys were already organizing search parties within 2 hours of when the accident happened. Volunteers were combing the swamps and the piney woods looking for remains of Columbia's crew, and actually the first remains turned up within an hour of the accident. Nobody could have believed that a vehicle that broke up going 12,000 miles an hour, 200,000 feet up in the air, that there would be this much debris coming down to the ground, let alone remains of the crew coming back as well. And so it became a very concentrated effort immediately by the local people, and then NASA's astronaut corps mobilized from Johnson Space Center to come up and help with the search for the crew. And you can see this is what the terrain was like that people were searching through here. It's very dense, forested type of terrain. They found one crew member within the first day after the accident. 2 more were found the next day. 2 more were found the day after that. So they'd found 5 of Columbia's crew within the first 3 days, but the other 2 were still missing. And it took another 10 days before they finally found the next 2 members of the crew. The idea was to, of course, emotionally, it was important to bring the crew back to their families. It was also important to try to preserve any kind of forensic evidence that might be in their remains to help NASA uncover what had happened to in the accident. And the search and recovery of the crew was largely a volunteer effort, locally done. Within the course of the first 24 hours, the population of the town of Hemphill tripled in size overnight as people came in from the Texas Department of Public Safety. 800 National Guard people mobilized. All kinds of volunteers turned up. People 70 years old were out there beating the bushes, walking through the swamps, fighting off the briars, fighting cold, hypothermia, sleet, rain. It was important to them. They took it on as their personal mission to be out there and try to find the crew and bring them back home again. And all around these people is debris. from the space shuttle. At this point, there was no time to be able to do anything more than just tag where it was. They didn't have the resources to bring it back again at that point. And one of the great stories of this was how the local population mobilized to help the volunteers and the searchers. This is the Vfw Hall at Hemphill. The wife of the Vfw commander, Belinda, got on the phone and started making hundreds of phone calls, and people started showing up with chickens, pies, mashed potatoes, everything you could think of. The town of Hemphill fed thousands of searchers over the course of the next 2 weeks. They provided somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 meals, a town of 1,000 people, at no cost to the government, completely out of the goodness of their hearts. And while the search for the crew was going on, NASA had brought the rapid response team from Kennedy Space Center over to start trying to bring back pieces of Columbia so that they could figure out what was going to go on with what had happened as part of the physical breakup of the ship. And Jerry, who you'll see here on the phone, was the coordinator for the rapid response team for the debris recovery effort. I guess, Jerry, if you'd like to talk a little bit about what you did the first couple of days.
Sure. So after we got the families back to the crew quarantine facility, I started working on getting them transportation back home. Once I got them on the airplanes and had them headed back to Houston, then I had the responsibility for trying to figure out what we were going to do next. And as being a member of the rapid response team, I was told that they were going to be activating it and that I needed to get my stuff together and get out to the shuttle landing facility where an Air Force C-141 would be transporting us to Barksdale Air Force Base up in the Louisiana-Texas border. We got there very late at night after I got up about 2 o'clock in the morning to do the weather reports and everything else in preparation for the landing. We got there, we went to the airport and got our rental cars and crashed in a motel that night. Got back on site at Barksdale Air Force Base early the next morning, and they asked me to take a team of engineers and with my car down to Lufkin, Texas to start initiating the preparations for the search of all of the debris. And when I got down there, the first thing that the locals wanted to do was to have the engineers go out and start performing searches of all of the school grounds and other venues that might have hazardous materials that would preclude them from opening schools as planned the next day. And then while they were off doing that, I started meeting all these representatives of the alphabet soup, if you will, of the local, state, and national organizations that were there and coming in to establish a network to help us with our efforts. I also learned that as soon as all of the human remains were discovered, that all of the state troopers and the National Guard and all those people would be leaving. And so it was up to me to figure out how we were going to staff up enough people and coordinate those people to do a detailed ground search for the material. That afternoon, I had received word that there had some reports of sonic booms over at Fort Polk, Louisiana, and that they had done some searches out in their backyards and found some holes with water in them.
This is one of them on the screen here.
And I was able to commandeer a National Guard helicopter and flew over to Fort Polk. It was getting towards dusk when I got there, but they took me out into the forested areas and found a couple of these holes, and there was enough material still sticking above the top of the water that I could immediately tell that it was the power heads of the shuttle's main engines, the pumps packages that I was seeing. And from looking at them, it was obvious that they had come straight down because there were trees, branches all around them, and most of the tree branches were not hit. So it was obvious that the things had come straight down. It was fortunate it was out in the middle of nowhere, basically. So I then took the helicopter back up to Barksdale Air Force Base, reported what I had seen, and a couple of days later, teams were down there at Fort Polk starting to recover that debris. And the next day, then, I went back down to Lufkin, and we started to establish a team that would then spend 3 months searching for the debris from an area just south of Dallas all the way over to the Louisiana border. It was not an easy thing to do, and I was really amazed at the resources that were provided to us. And probably the most significant resources were the firefighting teams that were brought in by the Forestry Service, and they came totally equipped. They came as a team. They had their communications, their transportation, their food systems, their living quarters. They came in to a bare area, and in no time at all, they had a camp set up and they were ready to go to work. And I think one of the most rewarding aspects of this entire thing was that many of those teams that came in were primarily made up of Native Americans. And they were so excited to be able to contribute to NASA and our country's efforts to get the shuttle flying again. So that was a very rewarding aspect of all that. But we basically drew a line on the ground based upon some early inputs of debris that we found. And then we started developing a grid search pattern. We established that we would do a ground search plus and minus 2 miles on each side of that line, all the way from south of Dallas over to the Louisiana border. And then we also started to arrange for searches from the air. We would extend that search another 3 miles to each side of the central line. So we searched plus or minus 5 miles total from that line using helicopters and fixed wing aircraft. And we also had the Navy come in with their salvage teams to provide the capability to search the reservoirs and lakes in the area as well. Incredible experience. I had the head of FEMA telling me that we were spending, I think it was like $4 million a day, and it was my responsibility to make sure it got done quickly so we didn't spend any more than we needed to. But an incredible effort and an incredible example of how our country can bring to bear tremendously capable and numerous forces to get the job done in an amazing fashion.
Yeah. It was basically, it was one of those kind of things where we'd had all these volunteers that were out there working. NASA didn't want to put people in harm's way after the crew had been recovered. It was somebody was bound to get hurt if they continued to use volunteers, and it was not fair to the local townships to have them continue to supply this kind of resources to support a prolonged period. So that the Texas Forest Service and the U.S. Forest Service were the ones who came up with the idea about using these firefighters. They come as self-contained teams of 20 firefighters. They're used to fighting in wildland fires out in reservations or out in the forests out west. They're trained in grid search techniques. They're trained to walk, in a line, arm's length apart, across an area, looking for pockets of still smoldering embers and things like that. The Forest Service realized that kind of grid search technique was going to be the same kind of thing that would work for to help to find debris. All you had to do was to train them what to look for. And so you can see these people here. Basically, the Forest Service had in the field between the end of February and the end of April, they had somewhere around 2,500 people a day out there in the field in teams of 20 doing this kind of grid search, walking forward through all kinds of terrain, looking at the ground to see what they could find, looking up in the trees to see what they could find. The majority of the material they found was actually smaller than 1 square inch. A lot of what these guys brought back in this kind of terrain were things the size of your thumbnail. That's how good they were at looking for material out there. It was just an incredible accomplishment that these people had to be able to do that kind of work.
The amazing thing to me was we brought back 40% of the dry weight of the vehicle, which is incredible considering the scale of the operation and the type of conditions in which the accident occurred.
Yeah. Jerry touched on briefly that there had been a water search as well. There's a very large reservoir, the Toledo Bend Reservoir, that's between East Texas and Louisiana border, and this was right in the area where a lot of the crew module from Columbia was coming down. And one of the things that NASA wanted to try to find was where there were cameras who were on the underside of Columbia that had taken pictures of the external tank as it was falling away. Those images had not been transmitted back to Earth, so NASA was looking for those cameras. They never found them. The Navy the Coast Guard, the Houston Police Department, and the Galveston Police Department worked on Toledo Bend Reservoir. They conducted over 3,000 dives. They spent more than 800 hours on the bottom of the lake, in most cases with visibility not more than a couple feet in front of your face. They had sonar all along the path. They were trying to find things. They ended up only finding actually 2 pieces of debris from Columbia in the lakes, but it was a heroic effort. It at least made them feel that they had done such a good job of searching that there was nothing major down there that they could have found. And Jerry also talked about the air search. The Forest Service had 38 contracted helicopters that were flying on both sides of the main debris zone with spotters from the Forest Service and NASA who were looking out the window and trying to find pieces of debris that were lying on the ground. And on the day of March 28th, there was an accident. This crew here, and this is actually the day of the accident, they were taking a break while their helicopter was being refueled. Buzz Meyer, who is this gentleman, was an Army veteran, a Vietnam veteran. He had retired and was flying tour helicopters out of the Grand Canyon when he heard that the Forest Service needed help. He volunteered, brought his helicopter to East Texas. Was flying with a team of 2 NASA people from Kennedy Space Center, a fellow from the U.S. Forest Service, and Charles Krennick, who was from the Texas Forest Service, a resident of the local area there. As they were flying at treetop level over the bayou there, late in the afternoon of March 28th, their engine suddenly quit, and there was no room for them to be able to maneuver out of the way. They crashed through the forest canopy. And the pilot, Buzz Meyer, and Charles Krennick, who were in the front, were both killed instantly when their helicopter crashed. The Forest Service gentleman and the 2 KSC gentlemen both survived with serious injuries, but they were able to walk away from the accident. And this became, to the people of East Texas, this even more cemented to them the feeling that they had that God had brought the shuttle there for a reason. They felt that they were the people who could best, in America, who would have best been able to help protect NASA and help look for the crew. And now, by losing one of their own people in the search, the motto that they had been using was that their mission has become our mission. And this became even more now part of their feeling that they had given their blood to help NASA bring the space shuttle back. And Jerry went to the funeral of both men, I believe, and
I didn't
spoke
go to Charles, but I did speak at Buzz's out at the rim of the Grand Canyon.
But again, it impressed upon NASA how deeply the people in East Texas felt how important it was to them to see NASA get flying again, that they would make this kind of sacrifice without grumbling, without complaining about it. They felt it was their patriotic duty to make that kind of sacrifice for NASA. So we need to make sure that when we talk about the loss of Columbia, it's not just 7 astronauts. There were also 2 people who gave their lives in the search for the crew and the ship. Now, once all this debris was being collected, NASA wanted to take a look at it. And back at Kennedy, they had a leased hangar that was right at the end of the shuttle landing facility. And with the help of the NTSB, they laid out what the shuttle would look like. Initially, they wanted to look at the underlying surfaces of it. This is a view of the reconstruction hangar. You can see Columbia's nose gear here, some of the other landing gear on the side. It looks like there's not much of the shuttle here, and then in fact this is only about 3,700 of the 84,000 pieces that were recovered that were on the floor here. Most of the material was in racks along the side of the hangar, again because most of the material that came back was a lot smaller than this. There was a separate walled-off area where the crew module was being reconstructed in 3D, and that was being run by Pam Melroy from the astronaut office. Every piece that came back from the field, every piece when it was being collected was GPS tagged where it was found, so NASA knew where every piece came from, down to the smallest nut and bolt. It was entered into a database, and NASA was able to start using that information to feed back to the search parties. And here are some of the materials that were in the Avionics bay for Columbia. One of the main things they wanted to try to find was the OEX recorder, the Orbital Experiments recorder that only Columbia had because it was an experimental vehicle when it was initially built. but it still had all of these sensors that I believe had thousands of different types of sensor readings. That if NASA could find that, they could help to determine what went wrong with the ship. And so as these pieces of material from the avionics bay began to turn up, NASA knew where they'd been found. They knew where they were in the shuttle, and it helped to direct searchers to go back and make sure that they covered an area very carefully. So the feedback was going back to the field, and in fact, they did find the OAX recorder on March 19th, and it was in remarkably good shape. You could still read the property tag on the side of it. Again, hard to believe this item fell 200,000 feet. It was, and the people who found it said it was just basically sitting on a little rise next to the crater where it had bounced from. The tapes inside of it were readable up to the moment that the shuttle broke apart, and so the NASA was able to get the confirmation of what was going on with the shuttle in the 30 seconds after transmissions stopped to Houston until the vehicle broke up. So this was a major find. Again, and it was interesting. This was an area that had been searched several times previously. That the search team finally found this. The day this was recovered was the day the United States invaded Iraq, and so that's one of the reasons that I find that people don't remember the Columbia accident. You ask people about, you tell them you're doing something about Columbia, and they'll tell you about Challenger. And I say, no, this is the one that happened over Texas, and most people just, if you weren't part of the NASA family, if you weren't in East Texas, you probably don't remember Columbia very well. And that was because we were getting ready to go to war at that point. And in fact, in the middle of that search and recovery effort is when we invaded Iraq. So I was talking about getting some of the feedback in terms of the GPS coordinates, and it allowed NASA to now start trying to piece together how the ship came apart. And by looking at identifying the pieces and again where they were found, this is an example of the type of debris plot they were able to do. The red is pieces of the left wing, the blue is pieces of the right wing. So this tells us that the left wing came apart before the right wing came apart. The shuttle was traveling from west to east. So again, bits and pieces of this kind of information start coming together. In general, some of the lighter pieces came to the ground before the heavier pieces. The power heads were the farthest east pieces that were found. They were still probably traveling supersonic when they hit the ground. The other pieces started falling down after they got into air resistance and then would come down. Most of the crew compartment came down farther east. But again, this starts to help NASA tell the story about how did the orbiter actually break up. Looking at the tiles that came back, this is one of the analyses they did in the reconstruction hangar. They built a tile table, which is a reproduction of the underside of the left wing of Columbia, with all of the grids marked out for it, where every tile would be. They were able to identify the tiles they got back in several cases by just examining several millimeters of thickness difference between different tiles. The identifying numbers had come off. But you're able to see here, this is the left wing, this is where the landing gear door would be. This is the leading edge of the wing. And so there was much more of the right wing that came back than there was of the left wing, which says, again, that pieces of the tile were starting to come off earlier and maybe not make it to the ground. By looking at the tiles, they were able to see that the tiles that were right at the edge of the leading edge here had bits of molten metal that had been blown out onto them from the inside of the wing, melting out and being blown out through vents onto those tiles. Farther back, the tiles showed patterns where it looked like the underside of the side of the tile that was bonded to the orbiter, where the glue had actually come apart. And so those were indications that the wing was heating up inside and loosening the glue and making those tiles pop off different ways. So we started again being able to figure out by doing forensics on that material how the wing came apart. Here's a technician or an engineer looking at bits and pieces of the RCC, the reinforced carbon-carbon from the leading edge of Columbia's wing. And you can see some of these pieces are pretty small. And all of this material is stuff that was found out in the middle of nowhere in Texas. Again, by measuring all of this, they were able to start piecing it together and figuring out where on the wing this had come from and analyzing the material. They put them together into these 3D frames, and here's Mike Leinbach explaining it. So to be able to understand how the wing structure looked, they put those pieces together into like a 3D jigsaw puzzle to be able to look at each one of the panels on the wing. And again, we began to see that there was a hole at panel 8 where it looked like the foam had hit the orbiter. Most of panel 9 was missing. The metal that was behind those two panels was gone. But the metal, the same type of metal, was deposited as molten material on the inside of the adjacent pieces of RCC on the inside of the panels, which indicating, again, heat getting into the wing and then melting the metal on the inside structure of the wing and depositing that on the other parts of the wing. So again, very interesting type of forensics work that was done there to figure out how the orbiter came apart. So by the beginning of May, when all of the recovery had ended, NASA had a very clear view between the OEX recorder, the data that was being analyzed in Houston, and now looking at the bits and pieces of the wing here. They had a pretty clear view that something had punched a hole into the leading edge of Columbia's left wing, allowing hot plasma to go inside and melt structures on the inside of the wing. A couple years later, a more detailed analysis was done, and it was determined that the actual proximate cause of the accident was that the plasma melted through the hydraulic lines, which caused them to lose control of the elevons and the body flap. And so Columbia was no longer able to steer itself, and it went into a spin, and then the wing broke off. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board didn't get into that level of detail with the analysis. And of course, you'll remember this test that was done in the beginning of July of 2003, where they fired a 1-pound block of foam about the size that broke off at a piece of RCC that was recovered from, or that was taken off of Space Shuttle Discovery, and you can see that it actually did blow a hole through the wing there. It seemed incredible to people that a piece of foam, about like a piece of a styrofoam cooler, could do that kind of damage to a heavy piece of panel like that. Interestingly, Mike Leinbach does not believe that he can't make himself believe that it actually punched a hole in the wing. He thinks that it may have displaced a carrier panel. He acknowledges that the stuff that plasma was able to get into the wing, but he still has a hard time wrapping his mind around the idea that something that's that thick could get punched through by a piece of foam.
I found it hard to believe at first, but I thought that the RCC was much thicker than it ends up being. It's really only about as thick as a cardboard box. Mm-hmm. And if you've ever had your hand out the window going down the road at 60 miles an hour and get hit by a bug, it can sting pretty good. And this is about a 1.5 pound piece of material. It was traveling at about 500 miles per hour by the time it hit the wing.
Yeah. So pretty convincing evidence at this point of what had happened. And now the question becomes, okay, we've got all of this debris. We've got 84,000 pieces of debris weighing somewhere more than 40 tons. What do we do with it? After the Challenger accident, all of that stuff went into a silo at Complex 31 at the Cape. Mike and his team realized that Columbia here represented something very different than Challenger. Challenger was basically a breakup in the atmosphere due to aerodynamic forces. Columbia's debris had been subject to all kinds of things that Challenger had not been. There was hypersonic reentry, there was plasma effects, oxidation, there was melting, there were aerodynamic stresses from being at a hypersonic speed that Columbia was not, the Challenger was not subjected to. So, and the debris that came back from Columbia represented 10 times all of the rest of the material from every other hypersonic reentry that had ever been recovered. So you have 10 times as much material back now that you could potentially use for scientific study. And so they established the Columbia Recovery Office, and Columbia now resides in a room on the 16th floor of the VAB. Mike Cianelli, who is the gentleman here on the right, was a test conductor for NASA at Kennedy Space Center before the accident. He became one of the people riding in the helicopter searching for debris during the recovery period, and then eventually became the head of the recovery office there. And his responsibility includes now not only Columbia, but also curating Challenger and Apollo 1. What NASA does now to make Columbia a lesson for all of its employees is that everybody who starts working at the Cape whether you're a contractor or NASA, they encourage you very strongly within the first month of your visit, or of your working at the Cape, to go through the Columbia Recovery Office and see the consequences of making a decision or making a non-decision. And so it's a very tactile reminder of what can happen if you make the wrong decision and don't think through the consequences of an action. So there are pieces of Columbia that are still on display for people who are working at the Cape to be able to take a look at. Here's what remains of the tunnel leading back to the Space Hab module. There's some of the RCS thrusters that were recovered. Some of the tanks from Columbia that were recovered are in back rooms there. Most of those came back in good shape. Most of Columbia resides in boxes like this, again, because most of the pieces are only a couple of square inches at most in size. And again, they're all cataloged. NASA knows where every piece is. If somebody wants to study what happened to a certain structure at a certain time, they can go through and pull this material out within a day or so and get that information to you. And that's what Pam Melroy did in the crew survivability report that came back several years later, and pulled critical pieces to be able to analyze in more detail how the crew compartment came apart, and put together a detailed timeline of how the crew came apart, or the orbiter came apart. And so you can fill out a material request form like borrowing any other type of material from an institution. Here, this is a material request form from Johnson Space Center to get pieces of the RCC from the right wing so that they could start preparing their on-orbit repair techniques that were going to be used and tested out on the return to flight mission, STS-114. So you can petition if you're a research institution to get this material loaned to you to study. Mike also has been the one who was behind, this is the Forever Remembered exhibit. Mike is the one who was behind getting the families of Challenger and Columbia to agree to have this material presented to the public and be able to be on display. So he's been the driver behind that. He was also the driver behind getting the Apollo 1 hatch on display now at Kennedy Space Center, because, again, it's one of those things the families believe that it's important for people to learn from the mistakes that we've made in the past and not to let that kind of thing happen again. And two other unsung heroes who I want to talk about are Belinda Gay and Marsha Cooper. Marsha is on the left here. Belinda was the one I was telling you about that was running the food service operation in Hemphill. Marsha was one of the Forest Service workers who who was involved in the search for the crew. The two of them became so convinced that it was important to preserve the legacy of Columbia and the participation of the people in East Texas that they have single-handedly been pushing through an incredible amount of work to start various types of memorials for Columbia. They're trying still to get the National Park Service to set aside the area where Columbia's nose cap came down. They call it the nose cone site. They want to make that a memorial park for people to come and ponder Columbia. But they've also started the Columbia Museum, Remembering Columbia Museum in Hemphill, Texas, and with the help of NASA, getting material from NASA, from Kennedy Space Center, and from Johnson Space Center, and also with the families of the crew contributing a large amount of personal material, memorabilia, as well as material that was recovered from the crew's personal effects during the mission. It's a wonderful museum. If you ever find yourself out in the piney woods of East Texas, you really need to go by the Remembering Columbia Museum, because they, again, take this very seriously as their sacred duty to preserve the memory of Columbia. They've got they've just had a volunteer now has donated a full cockpit simulator that they use for children now to come and practice space shuttle missions. And they even, Belinda and Marsha even went so far as to have a Lone Star monument that was in the middle of the town rededicated to Columbia. And it used to be just a Texas Lone Star. Now it says the Sabine County Columbia Memorial. Their mission became our mission. So that's at a very high level, walking through an incredible story of, again, how 25,000 people came together to do something that it's such a shame that we don't remember more about nowadays. Because of their efforts and their sacrifices, NASA was able to get the Space Shuttle program back on track again. It was a bittersweet thing because part of the recommendations from the CABE, the Columbia Accident Investigation Board report, was that NASA could only fly enough to finish the International Space Station, and then they needed to retire the Space Shuttle. And so, unfortunately, the demise of Columbia, even though we got flying again, it did spell the end of the program eventually. And so we're still waiting to come back to flight again for NASA, and I'm sure we'll start seeing exciting things again happen soon. We're going to have, our book is going to be coming out late this year. It's with the publisher right now, and I will verify to you that it does actually physically exist.
It's all blank.
Yeah. It's 352 pages. It's written from Mike's point of view, but it's got the story of all of these volunteers, and there's great information in there from Greg Kors, who was a Forestry Service technician who got battlefield promoted to run the search operations in Sabine County, Texas. He saved his diaries, and we've got interviews with him and how he went about what was going on day by day in the search for the crew. It's just an amazing, for me, amalgamation of all of these different types of viewpoints and what it took to bring Columbia back home again.
A lot of normal people really stepped up and did great service to the country.
While you're waiting for our book, I strongly encourage you to buy Spacewalker.
How much was that?
Yeah. You get a free copy of mine. Yeah. No, Jerry's book is great. He's got a very detailed accounting of his own participation, very personal story of his relationship with the crew. A lot of what he's talked to you about here today. But again, a great read. And here's what our book's going to look like when it comes out with Skyhorse Publishing. If you want to follow us in the meantime, www.bringingcolumbiahome.com. Mike and I maintain a blog there where we were kind of real-time blogging 14 years later what was going on with the Columbia Search and Recovery. Mike's got some great personal recollections about what it was like to be a shuttle launch director as well. And so with that, we come to the end of this part of the story. And we've got, with somebody here who is directly involved, this is your opportunity to ask questions about Columbia Search and Recovery. Yes, sir?
Was there any concern about people keeping the parts?
Was there concern about people keeping parts? Yes.
We still have some parts that get mailed to NASA every once in a while. There were several individuals that were trying to buy it, to put it on eBay or whatever else and sell it, but the federal agency got in to file very quickly, and that turned around most people's efforts to try to do that kind of thing.
Pieces, one of the guys from the FBI told me that pieces began appearing on eBay within 4 hours of the accident. And it is a federal crime to keep shuttle material that is not legally yours. And so there was a week-long moratorium for people to return pieces from Columbia. And what actually happened was they started getting phone calls saying, does this apply to Challenger material as well? And NASA said yes, and in fact some pieces of Challenger got turned back in after that had washed up on the shore, so people had been holding on to Challenger.
We still have Challenger material that shows up on the shore every once in a while. Every once in a while somebody, especially during last year when we had a drought in Texas, there were still things that were popping up out of the levels of the lakes as they dropped down and things like that.
Yes, sir?
One thing I'll add, I have been to that museum in Hemphill, and it's relatively easy to get to. It's kind of off the beaten path.
You got to get lost to get there, but you can get there.
The beauty of it is, if you're speed limits in Texas, you can get there really quick. But
don't stay there after dark.
don't go walking in the woods after dark. You won't get very far. But anyway, I encourage anybody that's got an interest in the shuttle program, go visit it. I visited it about a year after it started, and it keeps getting better and better. It talks about Columbia during its operations and also talks about the recovery. They've got elements there from all the astronauts' families.
Yeah.
So
it's
worth a visit.
It's really beautifully done. It's one of the best museums that I've been to. I mean, it's not very big, but it's got it's a museum that's built by love, and also with the desire to make sure that people continue to learn about the shuttle from that. Yeah.
We're all familiar with the great Southwest Spectacle folks video of the foam shattering of the panel. Did they do any more testing after that, or was it, oh, okay, we got it, we go home now?
They had a test matrix, but I think that was kind of one of the last steps in the test matrix, and I think they pretty well convinced themselves that they basically had done what they needed to. I don't know if there was any more testing, but I don't think so.
They had originally, their first thing was to try to put some tiles onto Enterprise's landing gear door and just to see how tile would react to it. The time they did that, they had already finished the reconstruction effort, and they thought, well, let's just go ahead and do a couple more. They fired a piece of foam at a fiberglass RCC panel, and it scuffed it. It didn't break it. But then when they did this, they realized that's, and again, RCC is not cheap stuff, so they didn't want to go out breaking any more of it than they needed to. Yeah.
How aware was the crew of the foam strike while they were still in the middle of the mission, and what involvement did they have making decisions as they were coming home?
Yeah.
They were made aware of the concern that there had been a foam strike observed on the vehicle, but they are also, I think, were informed that most of the best engineering minds had considered it not to be a concern. They couldn't see it because we didn't have a robotic arm on that vehicle because they're trying to save launch weight. There was discussion about putting the crew members into their spacesuit and going outside and peeking over the side to see what they could see. But that would have required probably losing about 2 days worth of research in the Space Hab facility while you got the tunnels closed off and crew members went outside and all that. So that was decided not to be done.
Yeah.
I think a lot of things in retrospect, management probably would have wished they had done differently. There was a lot of discussion early on about whether or not we ought to effect some type of a rescue. We didn't have a vehicle that was ready to launch, but they thought that maybe they could get a vehicle ready to launch while the oxygen and water and food and things like that would have still been able to keep the crew alive for the vehicle to possibly get up there to rescue them. There was a lot of discussions along those lines, but every day that you delayed a decision, you were, shortening the amount of time that they would have to survive, and it was never made. The decisions were never made.
Yeah. We've got a good analysis of that on the blog site. There's Mike talked about doing that kind of rescue analysis, and basically the decision would have had to have been made within a day or so of the launch, and so many things would have had to go differently. You would have basically ended the mission immediately, and the crew would have gone into a low power mode.
Hunker down mode.
Yeah.
Low power, low food.
The main thing they would have to conserve was their carbon dioxide scrubbers. That was the number one consumable that was going to be the limit for them. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Were there any anomalous readings coming from the left wing during the on-orbit time?
I don't remember anything during the on-orbit time. I don't think they lost any sensors that I could recall, but certainly during the early parts of the reentry, they started to see quite a few anomalous readings that just got worse and worse as time went on.
Yeah. When they analyzed the OEX tape afterwards, and again, this was not material that was, or not information that was relayed to the ground. They did, about the time of the foam strike, they did see a couple of G reading on one sensor inside the left wing there, so they did register what they think could have been an impact at that point. But again, it was not information that was available to anybody during the mission. Yeah.
At what point will this go to the crew? Well, that's something great was happening inside the cockpit.
You may have seen a videotape that was being taken in the crew compartment during the early portions of the reentry, and that fortunately ended before things started to affect the flying qualities of the vehicle. It was not too long before the accident totally broke the vehicle apart, but the crew started to see some things. They started to talk to the ground about it. They're starting to see abnormal thruster firings and amount of thruster firings. They're starting to see some tendency of the vehicle wanting to roll to correct a side slip and things like that. So they were starting to see things, and then we were starting to, I think we were in the middle of another call to the ground just about the time that the transmissions ceased.
Yeah.
So it all happened pretty quickly.
On the recorder,
Yeah, one of the things that they found actually, and this was an interesting forensics thing after, when they were doing the crew survivability study, a lot of the control panels from the crew module came back, but in the process of being transported, switches were accidentally jostled or whatever, and so they couldn't really use those as evidence. There was one panel from the right-hand side, from Willie McCool's side, that was folded in half from the impact. And so they figured that kind of preserved what the switches look like. In the crew survivability study, they peeled that open and found 3 switches that were out of position from where they should have been, and those were to restart the APU, the auxiliary power units. So Willie McCool was aware that they had lost hydraulic power. He was attempting an unrehearsed procedure to restart the APUs. We think that there was probably somewhere between 7 and 30 seconds that the crew was aware that they'd lost control of the vehicle before they passed out, before they had hypoxia. None of the crew had their face masks down. They all basically passed out almost instantaneously when the crew compartment decompressed. But they did have that awareness. Mike told Willie McCool's wife when she was walking through the reconstruction hangar, he said, I'll tell you, Willie was one of the best pilots in the world. He knew there was something wrong with his vehicle, and he was doing everything he could to try to fix it.
And so was Rick.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
If I recall correctly, there were reports of a radar detecting something departing from the vicinity of Columbia. The first one over day or something like that.
Day 2 object, yeah.
The day 2 object. Any conclusions of what that might have been or was? Or?
That was analyzed. That was data that was not available till after the accident happened. The Air Force had a tracking system that was tracking that tracks satellites in orbit. They went back and they weren't even deliberately tracking Columbia. They just happened to realize they had been tracking it, and they found there was a suitcase-sized piece of something that started floating away from Columbia on the second day of the mission. It was floating away very slowly. So they didn't think it was something that had impacted the ship and then bounced off. And in further analysis, it looks like the radar cross-section was that of what an RCC panel would be. So it could well have been a piece of the wing that Yeah, Dave.
Were there any proposals to use the reconnaissance satellites to attempt to see what had happened?
Upper levels of management, we're talking about using all different types of national assets.
Yeah.
Thank you for being so specific.
Yeah, one of the, and this is one of the failures I think that was brought up, and one of the frustrations was, again, you get into this mindset that kind of started with Apollo 13 was, in God we trust, all others bring data, and you got into this weird catch-22 with the mission management team saying, we don't have the data that would allow us to go to request this kind of analysis from the Air Force. And of course you can't get that data without asking the Air Force. And so it became this weird thing where the engineers found themselves unable to justify why they needed to go get more data because they didn't have the data to know that they need to be able to justify getting more data. A real failure in management. But again, I think it's, in hindsight, that people now look at that as a failure in management, but it was probably not, other than the people who were frustrated by it at the time, it was probably not as evident. Yeah, Frank.
I've heard that argument several times, and it was a reasonable argument. But if you were to approach the Air Force, even with undocumented evidence, how likely would they be to turn down the request?
Pure conjecture.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. People have said we would have, I guess I'd heard things saying we would have been glad to do it. But again, would you have got, and if you got the information, and this was the other thing, is if we got the information, it's too late to do anything about it anyway. The crew can't do anything. So, Jerry, you were on the STS-27 mission where you guys knew you had a very badly damaged ship, and you couldn't.
We had a robotic arm, and we reached down underneath, and we saw a tremendous amount of damage. We didn't know how bad it was, and the camera was not of that good a quality, so we couldn't get a real good detailed view. The other thing was it was a classified military flight, and so our video going to the ground was encrypted, which further degraded the video that the guys on the ground were seeing. And so they didn't get all that excited about it, but we sure were. And after Columbia, they went back and analyzed the condition of our vehicle on that flight, STS-27. And I was told by the analysts that we lost one tile completely. And that tile happened to be right over the top of a antenna. And had there not been a double thickness of metal right there at that location, they said that we would have had burned through and probably would have been just like Columbia. And that was the second flight after Challenger. So you can imagine if we'd have lost 2 vehicles in such quick succession, that probably would have been the end of the program. And I was supposed to have been on the Challenger flight until changes were made in schedule, and then I was then on 27, so dodged a couple.
Yeah, and part of the logic that factored into this was because such a heavily damaged vehicle survived in the past. The space shuttle is a pretty robust thing. Even though it's out of specification, it shouldn't have all this damage. We know the bird can make it back home again, and so that again was justification to go ahead and not be worried about it. So, I'm afraid
false engineering.
Yeah, I'm afraid we got time for one more question, then I have to wrap it up. Yes, sir.
If we had extended, if the president had decided to extend the life of the shuttles, and we had them now to service the ISS, what might have been different? Could there potentially, what was the risk of having another fatal accident?
I was one that believed that it was just a matter of time before we would have lost another vehicle and another crew. Every time we flew, we were starting to discover more and more things that we had to inspect, fix, be careful about on each of the launches. They were getting older, the hardware. The vehicles would have had to go down for protracted, long, staged refurbishments, inspections. And so there was a lot of reasons to terminate the program. We were going to go into Constellation. Constellation would have been a great program. Had the Obama administration not canceled it, we would be flying Orion by now. And I also supported the termination of the shuttle program once the station was complete, because I wanted to get further away from the Earth than low Earth orbit. And we were not going to do that as long as we put all of our resources, people and money, into the shuttle program. So I was a supporter of the shuttle program being terminated so that we could get on with going back to the moon and on to Mars.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry we're out of time. I'm going to get a picture of the audience here because I love seeing you guys here. Okay.